pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horde.
In its second minute, the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleating voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as though he were standing up in the assault of a wave. The dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine! Swine! Swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but, on the contrary, that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness. A desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one's will, into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. My friends, Agitators Anonymous, episode 130 is my long-promised discussion, dissection, dissemination, and any other D you can imagine of 1984, George Orwell's seminal novel. I've promised to do this, over however many episodes, but it's quite the undertaking, quite the rereading, trying to sort of figure out, to delve through the many myriad of thoughts that you have on reading what is one of the most visceral, uncompromising, grim, and, truth be told, dark books you will ever read, that most people quote or most people discuss, I sense, without having read it or reread it. Maybe I'm being ridiculous there, but Agitators Anonymous episode 130, my friends, is George Orwell's 1984. It will, of course, contain my, my references to various things that I think are happening right here, right now. Every generation that has read it has different resonances. It resonates within elements of their society that they see around them very clearly, and these come and go, but 1984 remains. So you can support the show on patreon.com/alan.averill, AV or ILL. You can follow me on Nemthianga_primordial or primordial_official. This weekend, Primordial is playing 2 shows in Rennes. On the very, very slim off chance that you're listening to this and you live in Rennes, you go, oh, I did not know that. Well, come along. Lots of cool bands, including Aggressor and Fen. And then the following weekend, we have the Hamburg Halloween Bash, which has Witch Hazel, Night Demon, The Others, loads and loads of great bands, Portrait. It's going to be really, really a lot of fun. And then the day after, the Samhain Festival in Belgium, we are playing with the very exciting Zeal and Ardor and Ruins of Beverast. Going to be great. Right then. So, like I said, I've been promising this one for a long time. An overview of George Orwell's 1984. I did start it before, and I approached it more like my Heavy Metal Heroes podcasts, which are, randomly infrequent and unpredictable. A bit like I did the one with H.P. Lovecraft, for example, with a sort of a timeline and a discussion of Orwell's life and, his childhood and all this kind of stuff. And I re-listened to that one that I sort of gave up on about 15-20 minutes in, and I decided that the tone wasn't really right. What we're here to try and discuss is 1984, a look at the sort of underlying themes and do they have resonance in today's society. And so therefore, it sort of makes no sense to go back into when Orwell was 12, he lived here and all that kind of thing. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to create a sort of a timeline to discuss this. Of course, his life is really fascinating on its own. Before we get to this, which is basically his deathbed novel, and I'll get to that as well. But when you know this about his life, you can sort of feel it through the pages. You can feel he's just basically heading out the door with that middle finger exposed, going, right, fuck you all, here's my last shot, take it. And what a taking it is, because it's a brutal right hook. It's a brutal shot to the guts, whatever you want to call it. Orwell volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists, for example. Just as some background to the guy, he was shot in the neck, which he never really recovered from. He had a kind of a sickly lifetime. He never seems to have been healthy. And I think that this does colour his work, a sort of pallid, sweaty, pale kind of colour. It colours his writings, and he never quite recovered. I'll come back and forward into some of those things throughout this. But he went to the Spanish Civil War. He was a massive critic of the Stalinist Soviet system, say that quickly, at a time when many Western intellectuals seemed to be kind of enamoured with it. Looking at you, George Bernard Shaw. And an awful lot of what, say, for example, Animal Farm, and as it continues into 1984, are sort of inspired by for example, when he went to the Spanish Civil War, what he thought was the most distressing thing was that how the left sort of fell into infighting and fighting within each other. And he sort of realized that this sort of seemed to encapsulate all traditional socialist systems, and therefore they ended up verging into the form of authoritarianism that Stalinism represented. So he finds almost all of it reprehensible. I would advise reading Animal Farm along with 1984. Together they make good companion pieces. Also The Road to Wigan Pier, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, or of course, I mean, they're all worth a read, but Animal Farm, of course, is his other most famous work. I suppose these days they won't be considered so. Again, a rapier-sharp takedown of the Soviet system. But 1984 is all other kinds of dark. It's a really fucking dark book. You may have sort of heard it, and I think 1984 is a strange book that I think people discuss and in dispatches and maybe don't really delve into to get their hands deep into the muck of what it is. But it's other kinds of dark. So like I said, rather than do a timeline of his life, I'll try and go through some of the impressions of the book on a rereading, and of course try and address some sort of cliches that surround the book, or at least the narrative cliches of discussion that surround the book. I felt somehow that it's partly become a cliche to reference 1984, which is a shame, as in often, sadly, and sometimes it seems to be people this is what I noticed lately. Maybe it was different 10 or 20 years ago. I remember reading the book in the 90s, and the tone of it was very different. It felt like the percentage of people who were sort of that generation's, at least I remember handing the book around to different people to read, and the discussion was like completely open on the table about, for anybody who seemed to be sort of alert to what might be the perils of this incoming authoritarian system. Of course, we were younger, so we're a bit more naive and headstrong and full of other sort of, flowing post-adolescent hormones, or the idealism of being 20-something. But at the same time, it was open. There wasn't really a left-right axis on how to view the book. But I sense right now there kind of is. And often, sadly, it seems to be, how can we say, people on the left, or the new left, as I keep saying, not the old left, like I said, of which I feel part of, but the new left, and people who maybe socially sit easier with elements of what seems like encroaching authoritarianism in our society, who don't see or don't want to see the negative sides of technology. They often roll their eyes at the mention of 1984, as in, oh yeah, of course, everything's Orwellian, Alan. Yeah, whatever. Oh, Orwell, blah, blah, blah. And when you dig down into it, you realize that it's a sort of a cliche from both sides. It's a cliche from the side warning about the incoming, technocratic surveillance authoritarian state, which I think is fairly self-evident, and those who are sort of pushing back against the kind of people they think are, worried about those kind of things, i.e., new left, new right, alt-right kind of axis, and that there are people who will push back on Orwell's mere mention because they've heard that somebody in the alt-right has mentioned it. Whatever all these things mean, very difficult to get a handle, I think, realistically on them because they're so fucking nebulous. But the people who don't really want to see, I think, the negative sides of the encroaching technological state, they often roll their eyes as I said, oh yeah, everything is Orwellian. Of course, mostly, as I said, from people who've never read the book, as take it in now and really digest it. And that's a hell of a lot of darkness to deal with. And I think, of course, statistics on who actually reads are, I guess they're way down. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I would imagine they are way down. The film 1984, which is, I think, a great depiction of the movie, is quite old now, and I don't think it's really enjoyed a sort of resurgence in cinematic terms. But then again, I'm not a cinema guy, so maybe I haven't a fucking clue. Well, obviously I don't. That's what you're doing, listening to Agitators Anonymous, because it's my me dealing with those very words, not having a fucking clue. Anyway, what the fuck am I talking about? Well, even with the main protagonists in the book, very few have narrative arcs that you would recognize in sort of modern storytelling, so to speak. And all of these arcs, if they do exist, they fill you with nothing less than dread, almost at all times. So it gets kind of shot down as a cliche to mention from people who often haven't read it, who are tired of hearing about Orwell in the context of modern society, who think it's just a go-to claim by the alt-right. Maybe something like this. Maybe it's just the conversations I have, but that's kind of how I view it, that Orwell is a kind of football, sometimes kicked about by two teams who don't really know the rules of the game. Wow. Awesome. Sorry, George, wherever you are, for trying to squeeze in a football analogy there. They try and play down the book's evident resonance for the modern age, but it's all in there, and that's what I'm going to try and have a look at. The joke is it's a warning written by Orwell, but, it's a warning written by Orwell to us in the modern day, but it's taken as a manual, a guide, a go-to guide by modern authoritarians, whether they are, let's say them, the Trudeaus or Ardennes or Macron, or for example, but couldn't you say the same about Machiavelli the Prince or, whatever else? So people, of course, rush to try and dampen down those comparisons, but do they exist? The truth is, of course, complex and resides in the grey area, which you're tired of hearing about me. But certainly when you read something like, for example, let's say, and this is what I'm going to do throughout this podcast, is refer to things that seem somewhat innocuous in the modern day and see. It's up to you to maybe try and see, does this hold some resonance within 1984, you see something like PayPal wanting to fine people. They did walk this back, but they wanted to fine people or stop their ability to use and make a living on the platform. But they wanted to fine people for misinformation, for what they decide to be misinformation by said user on other platforms. There's few words you can use for the control of information that better describe it than Orwellian. And this is exactly what happens within the novel. The party, which is Big Brother, the party control the dissemination of information. 2 + 2 = 5, if they say it does. Just as we have seen in many authoritarian regimes of the modern age. I just watched, for example, a documentary about North Korea and how the ruling family who came into power or were placed in power by the Chinese in the early 1950s basically rewrote the country's origin story. They have rewritten their role in world wars. They basically have rewritten history, so to speak, and their place within it. And it's taught, it's indoctrinated into children from a very, very, very young age. It is straight out of Orwell's dystopia. One of the first things to note is that I guess Orwell considered himself an old school socialist, a libertarian. But when I say that, I kind of mean French Rebellion old, that old. He developed a deep hatred of the Stalinist and communist system. And even though the Big Brother surveillance state described in 1984, bears, of course, hallmarks of what we now see as fascism, but also the communist state in this regard. There is, in my opinion, I suppose, some misconceptions when people say, for example, oh, Putin is behaving like a fascist. Well, he is, but he's also behaving like a communist in the classic Stalinist mold, even though I suppose he's becoming more Tsar-like. There's no getting away from the reality. An Animal Farm is the ultimate indictment of that system. It's, of course, an uncomfortable truth for people on the left, and maybe that's why they push back against the description of certain elements of modern society as Orwellian, because they know that he was sort of describing what their utopia can turn out to be. But this is, in my opinion, what he meant. So let's examine those words. Surveillance state. 1984 is set in a sort of futuristic London. I suppose on some level it's what you would call a kind of grotty steampunk London. But it's a futuristic dystopian state of constant war. Alliances formed, broken, made again. Its subjects live in a rotten, grimy, brutalized, shattered, filthy world, which is almost devoid of beauty. And I think by the end of the novel, you will feel devoid of hope. And that's one of the reasons, I suppose, why it's kind of a hard read, because what maybe in my sort of teenage years or my early 20-something, as I said, idealism, you were able to sort of, how can we say, get over some of the very visceral English, some of the very aggressive language within it, because you were sort of seeking out the idealism of that moment in your life. But it is a very visceral novel. It's dark in a really, really, really extreme way. The front of the war at this moment is the equatorial front, and it's perpetual war, and it shifts and moves. Eurasia, Oceania. The main protagonists within these wars, who the party is fighting, who they aren't fighting, constantly shifting and moving. The public never really knowing the truth, if there is one. When that's, of course, the main thrust is that there isn't one. And you can feel in the novel Orwell on his deathbed with tuberculosis is really having at it. This is his final novel, his final say, and he's bringing the fucking darkness to the table. I know I keep saying that, but it's an understatement. It's a starkly depressing, shocking read, and few of the characters have any redeeming features. Even when they seem to, Orwell almost scolds them for their lack of morals or lack of insight. The main character, Winston, considering the words surveillance state that I just said, is watched all day via a screen in his shabby apartment. He's woken and informed whenever Big Brother, the face that you would see in the movie, tells him to wake. He's given his 2 minutes of hate while he swills his rotten coffee in his grubby little apartment. And then, you just pause for a moment when you're reading it, and you drift off and you consider your own desktop, your own screens. Your phone is listening to you, right? It's listening to me recording this podcast. Under Obama, the story, where is it, the Patriot Act? They collected so much info on the public they didn't really even know what to do with it. Did they catch any terrorists? I think the truth is they didn't. Could we honestly say right now in 2022, we don't live in a technological surveillance state where we are constantly tracked by apps and on our phone or viewed by our cameras? I don't think we could. One up to Orwell. The frightening thing, he reflected for the 10,000th time as he forced his shoulders painfully backward. With hands on hips, they were gyrating their bodies from the waist, an exercise that was supposed to be good for the back muscles. The frightening thing was that it might all be true. If the party could thrust its hand into the past and say of this or that event, it never happened. That surely was more terrifying than mere torture and death. The party said that Oceania had never been in alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years ago. But where did that knowledge exist? Only in his own consciousness, which in any case must soon be annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan. Controls the future. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, had never been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it. Newspeak. Doublethink. Doublethink. These are the words that you constantly hear discussed about 1984. What does that mean? It just means, like I had been watching a documentary about Belarus last night. In 1984, just to hop back a sentence, what he's referring to here is the malignant bureaucracy of the Soviet state, a paranoid system where no one really spoke their mind for fear they were being watched, listened to. The party was and is everywhere. In old East Germany, the Stasi were so numerable, they put them at like 1 in 4 people were working for the state. And these are the state apparatus. In the book, the children join a spy camp where they're taught to spy on their parents. And like I said, I just watched a documentary about Belarus last night. Journalists going undercover, and even in small bars, no one would speak to them. They were, are you a member of the party? Lushenko had just ordered his troops to fire on protesters, killing, I think, 12, injuring more and arresting many, many more. Do we describe Belarus as Orwellian? Of course, I think it's the ultimate expression of what Orwell would have seen as where the utopian Stalinist communist state ends. Could we describe, let's be a little bit more generous, could we describe Ireland as Orwellian? No, and yes. Certainly during lockdown I would have said so. Police roaming the streets looking for people outside their 5-kilometre living radius. Just as in 1984 there is a forbidden zone where people are not allowed to go. Do our phones track us everywhere? Is every street in every city being filmed at all times? The truth is yes. You really have no privacy. And this is the thing that Winston longs for in the novel the most. Just to live a simple private life. But every morning Winston's screen clicks on and updates him on the war, but invites him, as I said, to his 2 minutes of hate. Big Brother controls all information, all truth. And as I said, he who controls those controls the past, controls the future, etc. Winston, as in one of our first meetings with Winston, he's gleefully cheering on the bombing of refugees in the collectivist hate sessions. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. You've probably heard all that before, right? War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. You've probably heard bands that you like quote that or put that into lyrics. In fact, I'm probably sure I've put it into some primordial lyrics somewhere or other. Who knows? You've, of course, heard all those before. Maybe you didn't know they were from 1984. Like I said, watching the documentary, for example, on North Korea, every morning the same music begins in Pyongyang. There are speakers in the street, and the songs just start instantly venerating the leader. So you can't even go about your day without hearing this street to street. All day the channels broadcast propaganda about the war with the Americans, creation myths written by the ruling family in the 50s. We are, of course, better in the West. I'm not being that hyperbolic that I suggest that we're all on the level of North Korea. We are, but, as I said, before we don't share a common version of the news anymore. It's highly editorialized. It's specific to your algorithm. But if you just look at CNN, I'm adding an extra N there, CNN and MSNBC in the United States, they're hawking for war, actively pushing us closer to nuclear war. Biden is upping the ante. The moronic figure of Liz Truss, who is gone now, I think. Sad day for Klaus Schwab, but she's gone, I think. Whose special word for, what can we say? Who the fuck is this woman? But Jesus, she was on some TV show saying, yes, I will press the button. I've read leftist climate change bloggers writing in big publications, and you could imagine them tip-tapping in a local cafe on their little Apple Mac or whatever. Could a small nuclear war be good for the climate? Of course, at the heart of the most extreme end of the climate movement is profound anti-humanism. As who pollutes? People. So kill them all. There's your hyperbole for you. But Where are the statesmen and women? Back in the 1980s, just to digress for a moment, but back in the 80s, we as kids were terrified of nuclear war. It was drilled into us. Millions of people protested in the streets, nuclear arms proliferation treaties, etc. And Brezhnev knew this. He knew this, but it took Gorbachev after him, along with Reagan. Oh, Reagan, wasn't he like a Nazi? Yeah, well, say whatever you want, but Gorbachev and Reagan got together and they called some kind of halt to the arms race and sort of to stand things down. And this is what thawed the Cold War, brought about the fall of communism, etc. But right now, by all accounts, we are nearer to nuclear war at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, but without anyone seemingly pushing back against it. For example, like at the time Kennedy did against the military-industrial complex. I suppose that was prior to the name being formed for it. But like I said, Khrushchev knew, and there was peace talks, or at least there was some contact to try and develop those. And now our political class seem to want nothing more than perpetual war in Ukraine so they can pour weapons into it. Just like Big Pharma made its coin during the pandemic, the military-industrial complex is looking at a solid 20-year war in Ukraine to pour arms into. Sorry, I digress. I said I was going to talk about the end of the world on Tuesday when I was talking about heavy metal. And sorry, Orwell, I'm using your walking on your grave here. But something is completely different to Afghanistan. As bad as that was, the threat of nuclear missiles being used didn't seem to be in play. But now, where are the people calling for steady hands and for us to pull back from the edge? It feels like our modern political class are not only historically illiterate, but lack any sense of statesmanship. I digress, but you knew I was going to do that. Anyway, doublethink. What's the point? So Big Brother says 2 + 2 = 5, then it is. Take a broader look at our society and the recent attack on STEM, which is the attack on STEM subjects, biology, science. Well, of course, science we know and can see can be bought or sponsored to have a certain outcome. But fundamentally, science is still science. But maths, for example, as I've said before, of course, most of our mathematical systems we have inherited, they ain't European, they come from the Middle East. But this critical theory concept that maths is just a racist construct. Don't believe me? Follow that paper trail. Do a bit of searching into what that means. Search attack on STEM, and you will find people saying, why can't 2 + 2 = 5? Maths, one of the pivotal structures of civilization. It's no doubt under attack. The same with biology. This is, to me at least, Orwellian doublespeak, plainly. I say this is so because it is so. The party which rules over all in the novel says it is so. And who is the party? Is this now the tech platforms who clearly, without allowing people any recourse to judicial rights, who decide what information can and cannot be discussed or shared, whether it's, I don't know, the Hunter Biden laptop story or Russian meddling or whatever you want to say, or dissent from, for example, the narrative surrounding COVID. The lab leak theory that once would have had you kicked off all platforms is now a commonly held theory. Is this, I don't know, is this Orwellian doublethink? I would say it has echoes of it. Any authoritarian system that seeks to control the flow of information, we could call this Orwellian. But what I am struck by on a rereading, being older, is how vitriolic the novel is. The stench of London, cabbages and overflowing lavatories. Laboratories? Yeah, I'm thinking about laboratories. Lavatories emanates from the page, sex is outlawed. Which, the atomization of modern society and remote living edges into that on some level. Does meta, the concept of meta itself, make sex redundant? These are things, I suppose, that, rattle around my empty skull. But there's rationing in the novel. There's an anti-sex league and they march through the streets. One thing that got me more on a rereading was Orwell's. He literally is attacking everyone and everything. 1984 is a remorseless book. It's like a revenge album. There's not a hint of harmony or humanity. Orwell's literal shock and awe. Everything is ugly. Public executions are entertainment. Is modern society so different? Do we not tune into Sky News the days after the invasion of Ukraine and watch retired armour generals postulate over maps, push boundaries around, colours here, colours there, and describe war in abstract terms that get around the fact that people are being killed? This morning I watched a documentary about Al-Shabaab, the Islamic terrorist group in Somalia. Entertainment or education? Or both? Or propaganda? Which is it? In the novel, young people join the spies to learn how to spy on their parents. To know and not to know. To be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies. To hold simultaneously two opinions which cancelled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them. To use logic against logic. To repudiate morality while laying claim to it. To believe that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy. To forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again. And above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. Sometimes indeed you could put your finger on a definite lie. It was not true, for example, as was claimed in the party history books, that the party had invented aeroplanes. He remembered aeroplanes. This is Winston now. He remembered aeroplanes since his earliest childhood. But you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. So much of the novel almost exists in another dimension. Not just, and I don't mean another, breakthrough to another dimension. I don't mean it like that. I mean, you can almost smell and feel the novel. It's not just words on a page. It's visceral, physical. It's a stinking read. The plot has three main characters: Winston, Smith, Julia, and O'Brien. And there are three groups of people: the proles, who are the main body of people, the inner party elite, and the outer party bureaucrats. Winston is a member of the outer party, a bureaucrat. He meets Julia. They start conspiring to create a world of what she instigates and calls love. This is kind of at her instigation. O'Brien is the other character whom the couple meet. And we wonder, is he a genuine rebel against the party? Of course he isn't. He ends up betraying them. Spoiler alert. And the final third of the book is basically Winston being tortured to within an inch of his life. The very last line of the book is, and he loves Big Brother. Every generation finds something relevant in the book, from 50s Cold War societies to our own world of, our world of fake truths and misinformation and all this kind of stuff. There's a huge through line that links them all, and that speaks to the sort of enduring truth that bubbles up to the surface in 1984 for every decade's readers. And don't forget, don't forget how ill Orwell was. And I do actually think this sort of affects the novel. Like I said, he got shot in the throat in Spain, which is worth noting. But he seems to have almost been ill, sent to sanatoriums to recover. And this no doubt colours a lot of his novels and a lot of his views of the world. And they certainly aren't healthy views of the world, I suppose. This is before antibiotics as well. So Orwell has tuberculosis. He's sent to an attempt to recover to a strict sanatorium. There's no sitting, there's no standing, no reading, no writing. 1984 has the urgency of a dying man. There's a form of this early tuberculosis society where factories are surveying their own workers, and if they fail tests, they could be whisked away, taken to the rehabilitation unit against their will. Sound familiar? Australia, COVID, China, COVID. Basically, the forced coercion and relinquishing of autonomy and consent is to the party at all times. And this has resonance from, those days of Orwell's life. But the pursuit of... Come on, Averill. Less caffeine. The pursuit of power had exceeded all moral limits and become an objective in itself. Let me just say that again. The pursuit of power had exceeded all moral limits and become an objective in itself. States one commentator I was listening to discussing 1984, and this sums up a lot of what passes for authoritarianism today for me. During lockdown or over the last decades, or constantly. Look, I'm a man who likes to argue. If you've been listening to Agitators Anonymous, the clue's in the name. People would ask me, why would the state do that? And I would tear my metaphorical hair out. The question should be, why wouldn't a state do that? Why wouldn't they want to accrue more power? Just for that reason in itself is the reason. Why wouldn't they use this opportunity to pass new rules that never get democratically scrutinized, issue extraordinary measures, emergency laws without opposition? Why would they not? And the truth is simply history. History dictates that is true. History is on my side, or Orwell's side, of viewing the world like that, if I can be so bold as to place us on the same side of the metaphorical fence. And this is sad but true. This is what states... Wow, did I really just do that? This is what states, the political class, governments, technocrats, the political elite, whatever you want to call it, this is what they do. It's okay, it's maybe not a 100% argument, but I can give you, if I was to sit there and think about it, over a pint or two, 100 examples of states using crisis as an opportunity to enact authoritarian measures over the last, we can just take 2 decades. And you can give me your examples of them enacting altruistic measures in opposition, and we can go toe-to-toe with what history actually dictates. Well, anyway, it's not to say that this never happens, of course. The world would be a terrifically dark place if that was always the case. But history dictates a few certain things. And I think Orwell, if I may be so bold, feels the same. He's skeptical of the recording of history. He's an empiricist, what you touch and what you feel. As an old libertarian socialist, Orwell believes in liberty, equality, fraternity. And by 1984's writing, he believes these values are simply being eroded in all societies and that history is being rewritten. Of course, his sights are mainly trained on the Stalinist socialist system, but I think he sees this in his own state and governance, in all states and governance. Could we call Orwell a humanist or a anarcho-syndicalist? But he's certainly a supporter of human rights in the most basic sense. Definitely, I think, the right to a free trial, to freedom of speech. And no doubt, these are things that are under attack right now, as I said, in our modern technocratic state, which encroaches on all of these things. Simply consider the way platforms unperson or cancel someone, however you want, because you have violated our terms of service. But why, you ask? No one answers. As in this debate, you have no right to a fair trial. And that would have been something that would have, you can read in the pages of 1984, almost like a warning from history. "Comrades," cried an eager, youthful voice. "Attention, comrades. We have glorious news for you. We have won the battle for production. Returns now completed of the output of all classes of consumption goods show that the standard of living has risen by no less than 20% over the past year. All over Oceania this morning, there were irrepressible, spontaneous demonstrations when workers marched out of factories and offices and paraded through the streets with banners voicing their gratitude to Big Brother for the new, happy life which his wise leadership has bestowed upon us. Here are some of the completed figures. Foodstuffs. The phrase, our new happy life, recurred several times. It had been a favourite of late with the Ministry of Plenty. The Ministry of Plenty. Which of your governments have been forming a Ministry of Truth or something along those lines? I would presume they wouldn't just go and call it that, but the Ministry of Truth is straight out of Orwell. Could we call, as I said, Orwell a humanist? Definitely a supporter of human rights. Definitely, I think so. But one thing is for sure, our two main characters, Winston and Julia, don't have anything like a modern hero arc or on some level, Winston longs for a simple life, but a private life, which is of course not possible. But he idolizes the concept of art without ever seeming to be able to tap into it. There's one scene where he goes, or one chapter where he goes to an old secondhand store, and he buys this beautiful notepad, and he finds a fountain pen, which is they're forbidden, and he buys it on the black market, but he can't write anything. All he writes is just nonsense. He realizes somewhere within his residual memory, he has some connection to something he sees as artistic, but he realizes he hasn't got an artistic bone in his body. But he wishes for a private life, which is what everyone kind of does, Most people, if asked, would wish for a smaller government that left them the fuck alone. And I think that that's also a deep longing of Winston in this novel. But of course, it's not possible. Big Brother is everywhere. But the other thing about Winston is he's a weak, enfeebled runt of a man. And he's full of misogynistic kind of feelings. And even Julia, who seems sort of like free and so on some level, doesn't quite bring them out. Winston calls her a rebel from the waist down. She loves sex and chocolate and makeup and good coffee, but at the same time throughout the novel seems frivolous and empty-headed, anti-intellectual. And you could read some sort of misogynistic sentiment into that. I suppose most people now would. I'm not sure if that exists, but certainly I think Orwell is definitely an equal opportunities hater when it comes to almost everybody in the novel. But what comes across in 1984 even more so is a special kind of place of hatred reserved for the proles, the working class, that Orwell on his deathbed seems to be really finished with them. He's given up on them. And he was a person who would have once stood up for them. And that's quite a dark sort of realization when you read 1984. He seems to have given up on people. Give them beer and porn and they are fine. It's clearly the message in 1984. Orwell has contempt for them. Every now and again you are just kind of overwhelmed by the sense that everyone and everything is inherently negative. Every paragraph is ugly. Orwell finds a few green shoots here and there, but they're invariably scorched and burnt by the next page. Maybe this is, as I said, his I'm sick, I'm dying, I'm out of here soon, so fuck you all, I have fucking no regrets style parting shot, but it's hard not to find it overwhelmingly bleak. I can see why now people argue about it and don't read it sometimes. 2 days of hate, 2 minutes of hate, a week of hate, 2 minutes to midnight. Let's have a hate week as promoted by the party. Is there any hope in 1984? In truth, whatever that comes to mean, I think very little. Winston has a small part of his brain left for himself, which he fears losing. But after years of attrition, the party even breaks into that. And like I said, the last third of the novel is basically their demolition of that, bombarding his notions of truth, of self, of freedom. And finally, as I said, the last line, he loves Big Brother, leaves you certainly with the feeling that Winston's last outpost of resistance was conquered. 2 + 2 definitely equals 5 because Big Brother says it is so. And it's a read that I would recommend, but it's a dark read. It's a very dark read, and I can understand why some people sort of approach it with trepidation, maybe. Or maybe it's just easier to discuss something that you haven't read. I don't know. Are we right to reference it with abandon? Are we right to feel it resonates with modern society? Are we being over the top and hyperbolic? Certainly the world of 1984 is not exactly the world we inhabit. Of course not. It is, though, the world of North Korea and Belarus, for example. And maybe, as I've said before in the podcast, if you think it isn't, then you're probably lucky enough to be in a place in the world where you can look out your window and feel like all is calm and go about your business. But as I said before, democracy isn't the default setting for society. It can easily change, and the instruments for its change to authoritarianism exist well and truly throughout all of the societies across this world. They exist within the phone you're holding in your hand. They exist within technology that allows you to listen to this podcast. And the needle is constantly moving, at least in my opinion, in that direction. And while 1984 is a horror novel, it's certainly not a fantasy novel. It's also a warning. And in darkly comedic terms, it feels like an instructional manual to some of our leaders, even though it's devoid of a comedy. But it is essential reading if you dare. My friends, that is my sort of all over the place take on 1984. I tried to sort of get into the characters, sort of dig down into some of the things that maybe it has resonance now. The truth, again, is the grey area. The truth is the grey area. Some of it has deep resonance, and if you're looking for it, you'll see it. And if you want to ignore it, you probably can for now. If I can be such an asshole, I can quote my own lyrics and say, you may look away, but your children will not. Well, my friends, Agitators Anonymous, episode 130. Cheers, Mr. Orwell, for darkening my day. A party member is expected to have no private emotions and no respites from enthusiasm. He is supposed to live in a continuous frenzy of hatred of foreign enemies and internal traitors, triumph over victories and self-abasement before the power and wisdom of the party. The discontents produced by his bare, unsatisfying life are deliberately turned outwards and dissipated by such devices as the 2 minutes of hate. And the speculations which might possibly induce a sceptical or rebellious attitude are killed in advance by his early acquired inner discipline. The first and simplest stage in the discipline, which can be taught even to young children, is called in newspeak crime stop. Crime stop means the faculty of stopping short, as though by instinct at the threshold of any dangerous thought. It includes the power of not grasping analogies, of failing to perceive logical errors, of misunderstanding the simplest arguments if they are inimical to ingsoc, and of being bored or repelled by any train of thought which is capable of leading in a heretical direction. Crime stop, in short, means protective stupidity. But stupidity is not enough. On the contrary, orthodoxy in the full sense demands a control over one's mental processes as complete as that of a contortionist over his body. Oceanic society rests ultimately on the belief that Big Brother is omnipotent and the party is infallible. But since in reality Big Brother is not omnipotent and the party is not infallible, there is a need for an unwearying moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. The key word here is black-white. Like so many newspeak words, this word has two mutually contradictory meanings. Applied to an opponent, it means the habit of impudently claiming that black is white, in contradiction of the plain facts. Applied to a party member, it means a loyal willingness to say that black is white when party discipline demands this. But it means also the ability to believe that black is white, and more to know that black is white, and to forget that one has ever believed the contrary. This demands a continuous alteration of the past, made possible by the system of thought which really embraces all the rest, and which is known in newspeak as doublethink. And he loves Big Brother.